Vielen Dank, Yvonne. Guten Morgen. Ich könnte vielleicht das Ganze auf Deutsch versuchen, aber ich vermute, dass Ihr Englisch besser ist als mein Deutsch und deshalb mache ich das auf Englisch. Okay. Protection poker is about, as it says on the slide, efficient and effective software security. And to achieve that, we want to make it risk-based. Now, risk-based is this buzzword. Everyone uses it. Nobody knows what it really means. But the thing is that we all, I guess, realize that it's impossible to prevent all security flaws and bugs. We have limited resources, we have limited time, we have limited skills, people, and so on. And thus, it's most important to identify those vulnerabilities, those risks that are high. So high risk is the important thing. And what do we mean by high risk? High risk is anything that can be easily exploited by attackers and or causes impact to important assets. So, protection poker. This is a game to do risk estimation in agile development teams. It was originally proposed some years ago, about a decade I believe, by Professor Laurie Williams at North Carolina State University. And as you might suspect, it's based on planning poker, which has been used for many years for effort estimation in agile development teams. So the idea, as originally proposed, is that protection poker is to be played in the beginning of every sprint during the sprint planning meeting. And when I say sprint, that's of course assuming you're doing Scrum, but it doesn't really have to be Scrum. It can be any kind of iterative, agile development methodology. So the goal, the reason we're doing it, is that we want to rank the security risk of the features that we are developing in this sprint. We want to, the first point of that is to ensure that you have a common understanding in the whole team on the need for security in this iteration. Also means that you hopefully then also manage to add security to the effort estimation, so that it doesn't come as a big surprise that, oh, you need to spend time making sure that things are secure. So an important side effect of playing protection poker is that it also helps to raise security awareness in the whole team, if not to say the whole organization. So in the scope of protection poker, we have adopted a slightly modified definition of risk. So we say that risk is value multiplied by exposure. You may be more familiar with the equation where risk is probability times consequence. But with exposure, we mean when you implement this new feature that you are implementing in this sprint, will it increase the attack surface of your system? Also, what competence do you imagine will be required to exploit this feature? How easy is it to exploit? And not least, what type of assets can be exposed when you implement this feature? That particular point will become hopefully more clear as we go on. And then value of assets. Now, what is an asset? An asset is basically anything that your system touches that has value to you, or your customers, or your employer, or whoever. Normally, we are talking about information assets, but but it can also be physical assets. Depends. So when we're discussing this for a particular feature, we want to know what kind of data is touched upon by the new functionality. So what kind of data does this functionality use? What kind of data does this functionality modify, etc., etc. And when you are considering the value, like I said, of course, one thing is the value for you as the developer, or potentially the organization running the system, but also consider what is the value for your customers, and not least, what is the value for attackers? Because the value for an attacker may not be the same as the value for you. So for you, of course, if you're running a website, if your website should suddenly disappear and everything is lost, that's not good for you. But it may not be of interest to the attacker. The attacker may be interested in other things, like changing your website to lewd messages or whatever. And then, to calculate the risk, we take the total value. So in terms of a given feature, we take the total value of all the assets that this feature touches. And we then multiply that by the exposure of that feature. Okay. So a slight interlude. When we're playing protection poker, it always helps to get a high-level overview of the system that we are building. And you can do this in any way you choose. We like to use data flow diagrams because they're sort of reasonably simple, reasonably easy to understand, and it's a fairly well-known, what's the term I'm looking for? The symbols and so on are fairly well known. So, and we use that. So, data flow diagrams are typically used when you're doing threat modeling, because you use that to get that high-level overview. So, also can use this to identify the trust boundaries in your system, and of course, as the name suggests, helps you to know how data flows in your system. And if you look at this to the right, so tasks or processes are circles, square boxes are entities, typically users, the arrows are predictably data flows, parallel lines, data stores or databases or files or whatever, and the dashed lines are boundaries. Now, if you have double circles like this, it means that this is a process which is complex or decomposable. But we won't really get into that. So this is just an example that we will use when we're playing protection poker in this example. It's something I stole from OWASP, from their threat modeling. It's what can we call it? Cheat sheet or fact sheet. So the example is it's a college library website. And it's fairly simple. You have users who use this web service. They can log in. There's a login process. And there are some static web pages. There is a database back there. Also has some user information, etc., etc. So, all fairly simple. And this is the example that we will use as the running example. Okay, so I will now give you an example of a new feature that will be developed for this application. So, in this system, college students may make a request for a new book to be purchased. What kind of assets could be involved? Of course, if this is something which is tied to a given student, there need to be some credentials. The student needs to log in somehow. There's some personal data involved if you want to record which student asked for this book to be purchased. Of course, the obvious thing, in order to start the whole thing, the student needs to have access to the web pages. There's a login session. There is audit data. You can use audit D, if you remember from yesterday. And there are some SQL queries involved, etc., etc. So this is just a brief list. There may be more assets. One important thing to notice, just in the context of protection poker, is that if you have very many small features, it may make sense to somehow group them, because otherwise you get this state explosion where you end up playing very many rounds, and it might be exhaustive. And speaking of rounds, whenever we play protection poker, we play at least 2 rounds. So for every asset that is involved, and typically there is more than one, we play 1 round of protection poker to determine the value of that asset. Important to note here is that when you are building a system that you will spend more than just 1 sprint developing, you only have to play for the assets once. Because assuming you didn't make any bad mistakes, or you didn't do any errors in judgment, you can reuse that asset value next time you play, which of course helps speed things up. And then you need to play for the exposure of the feature that you are building. Now, the order that you do this in is not important, but okay, we list them in this order. It works like this. If you really want to play for the exposure first, go ahead. Okay, so I'm now going to demonstrate how you play, you determine the value of the asset authentication credentials. And to help us illustrate this, we have our old friends, Alice and Bob. But of course, it's very boring to play poker with only 2 people, so we also have Eve and Charlie. Right. And so remember, the asset that we're playing for is credentials. Right. So everyone makes their bid and plays the card face down. So they have all now chosen what they believe the value of this asset to be. And one important thing that I didn't mention before is that it's all relative. So the cards are valued from basically 10 to 100. If you look at the card, you'll find that it's actually less than 10. This is just for symmetry. Could have put 1, but anyway. And it's relative to the application that you're building. So it's important that you don't try to compare apples and oranges. You may think that, okay, you are building a new web app for some social media platform, and you may feel tempted to compare yourself with your colleagues next door who are building a mobile banking application, but you should never do that. So it's always relative to your own application. So remember, keep this in mind. And also, so in this example, we are looking at this college library. So it's the credentials for this college library system. Right, so then what we do is that we all show our hands. And so you see that, okay, everyone seems to be agreeing that credentials are somewhat important, but there is some diverging values here. And the way we do it is that we have the extreme ends of the scale start out by providing their arguments. So in this case, it's Bob and Charlie who are at the opposing ends. So Charlie bid 70, whereas Bob said 90. So Bob then goes and says, okay, authentication credentials, that's pretty much the most important thing that we have, so it should be a 90. Whereas Charlie says, okay, so, but a password that sort of gone astray, that's not a crisis. It's bad, but we have other ways of mitigating this. So it shouldn't be close to maximum, like Bob said. And then Alice and Eve can pitch in if they have some additional arguments to make, but typically it's the extreme ends where we will spend the most time discussing. Of course, it could be that having heard Charlie's argument, then Eve maybe could change her mind and provide some supporting discussion. But anyway, we then take our cards back and we play again. As you can see, still face down, and then we turn, and then as if by magic, everyone agrees. It's lovely. Right, so normally then, if this was the first time we were playing, we would have to play for all the assets that we are going to use in this feature, but in this case we'll just skip those in the interest of brevity, and we move on to exposure for this feature that we are developing, so this feature of ordering a book. Okay, so we play again, and we flip. And now we can see here that there is a much larger divergence in this case. Charlie doesn't believe that this feature actually hardly has any exposure at all, whereas the other three think it's sort of mid-range exposure. Okay, so it's natural then that Charlie goes first, and he says, okay, all I can do is request a book. What could possibly go wrong? Famous last words. Then as a representative, so in this case, you just have to pick somebody. And another thing that I didn't mention is that when you play protection poker, it's very useful to have a moderator. Sometimes it's instrumental because you need to have sort of an impartial third party that can mediate. Because what we want is we want to have consensus. So we don't want to, so in this case, in theory, we could just make an average, but that's not the point. We want to achieve a consensus, so we pick somebody from the majority here to provide an argument for why it should be 50 and not 10 or less. So we pick Bob, and he says that this is a functionality which is available from the internet. So even though access is restricted, things could go wrong. So it's a 50. All right, so they can keep discussing. Probably Alice and Eve has some additional arguments to make. Eventually, we go again. And as if by magic, they all agree. So interestingly, just for you to note, we end up, through consensus, we end up at a 50, and it's not like if we did an average, which would make it a 40 or something. Another thing that I could add is that in these two very short examples, everything worked out really well. In practice, sometimes you do have some people who are difficult and who cannot join consensus by themselves. And in this case, it's very important to have the moderator step in and say, okay, you guys, how about if we say, could you agree to say 40? And then go a few rounds, and okay, hopefully you then arrive at some consensus value. And of course, eventually, if they don't agree, then the moderator will just have to cut through and just decide, okay, I decide that it is this. That's not the ideal situation, but it's sometimes something you have to do just to move on. As you might have noticed, the most important thing here is not really what the final number is. The most important thing is the discussion. Because when you're providing your arguments, why you think this is a 50 and not a 10, or why this is a 90 and not a 70, new information typically emerges. And you will get this kind of aha experience where other people in the team thought, oh, I didn't think of that. And then you hopefully arrive at some consensus. Once you've played this, you will then end up with a table, as you'll see in front of some of you. We have this form where you fill in all the assets, what their value is, and you then sum them up. And for a given feature, you then get the sum for that feature. So these are just some arbitrary numbers that I've chosen. And then per feature, you list them in the other sheet with various features. And then you arrive at the exposure that we just played for, so that's a 50. And then the sum of all the assets that this feature touches. And then you multiply and you get some risk value. Now, again, that number is not really interesting in itself. But it says something about the total exposure and value that this feature embodies. And you might think that, okay, so if you have a very simple feature that touches lots of low value assets, then the risk value will sort of inflate. And that's certainly true to some point. But it is also inherently, so if you have something which actually affects lots of different things, then okay, that could be important in itself. So it's maybe not that wrong. Anyway, to make this game effective, it's useful to do what we call calibration as part of the first playing. So, like I said, you are always comparing things to other things in your same application, your same system. You try to avoid apples and oranges. So you try to, at the very beginning, try to determine what are the extremes in your system. So which assets that you are working with have the highest or the lowest value, and which features that you can imagine that you will be building will have the most and the least exposure. So I, again, made some arbitrary examples here. We can imagine that this system also includes a feature which will give the librarians a coffee break alert. So it's been a long time since you had a coffee, go and have a coffee. That kind of a feature, of course, doesn't really touch any assets. It doesn't have any interaction, really. So we can imagine that it's very low exposure. On the other end of the scale, you will have the feature of adding a new admin user, which, okay, could be definitely considered to be high exposure. On the asset side, the general library info, the static web pages, is maybe the asset that is the least valuable. And in these days of GDPR and the, 4% of annual turnover possible fines, personal data is probably the most valuable asset that this system has. And when you do this, you can also then look at this as you're playing and try to compare. When you are trying to determine your the value of asset X, you can then compare that with your calibration. Hopefully, when you do the calibration, that is sort of also final for your system. but of course, it's possible that you will discover at some point that, okay, I was wrong. We actually have some assets that are more valuable than the personal data, and then you might have to redo the calibration. But anyway. Also, a small point on practical playing. From the animation, you might imagine that you're playing exactly like you do with the poker. You just throw the card at the middle of the table. That's actually not a good idea when you're playing protection poker, because you need to remember who bid what. So it's actually useful to see, okay, this is Charlie's card. And also, when you're done with a round, you want your own card back again, because you always want to have those same 10 cards. So that's just a practical tip. Okay, so that was a very brief introduction. And I see we don't really have a lot of time, but we can give it a go. So you'll see that there are some cards spread around. So if you can try to congregate some 5 people to a group, we can try to see if we can do a quick round of protection poker. I would suggest that we just simply start by playing for the exposure of a new feature. And the feature that I suggest that we can play for, do we have some chalk? The feature will this be caught by the camera?
I don't think so.
Here? Yeah. Okay. So you try again. So, the feature is to make a reservation for a book that's already in the library. I'm standing in front of the text, so, right. So if you can try to make those groups and try to hand out the cards. So everyone is supposed to have, yeah, question?
What's the calibration?
Well, the calibration is just have to accept the calibration that I made. Ideally, we should have done the calibration, but we would have needed an hour. So. For the people in the back who don't have cards, and if you want to try to play, there are more cards at the front.
Do we start with exposure or with value?
Starting with exposure. So just exposure of this new feature, ordering a book that's already in the library.
Das war dasselbe Feature, was eigentlich auf der Plattform beantwortet, wer wann was geliehen hat oder beantragt hat, und das ist aber nicht dasselbe. Das finde ich auch eine Kategorie. Ja, genau.
This is not about value at all. It's just how easy it would be for an attacker to get.
Yeah, and that's also an important thing. That it's many people when they start playing, they all confuse the concept about assets and exposure. They start talking about the exposure of an asset, for instance, which it's not about. So in this case, it's just about the exposure of the feature. But of course. Next, you would then need to determine the value of all the assets that this feature touches, which I don't think we will have time to do. But
what's confusing is because in the example it was like, I think Bob said, what do we care about this feature? It's just request a book, which isn't really about exposure, right? It's more about value.
yeah,
So that's why I'm confused.
yeah, but it's like I said, exposure is also related to what kind of assets the feature will touch. But I agree. It's sort of it's a bit interweaved.
Assets that this touches would be like a cursor, application, the data, the booking data is an asset.
Yeah. Because as you might appreciate, at least in some contexts, the fact that you, I don't know, if you try to order, I don't know what the law is in Austria these days, but if you try to order Mein Kampf, if that is actually legal, no.
Did that change recently?
Yeah. Yep.
Where Steffi ist. Steffi? The question was if there's a value for the assets
Yeah. So for this brief, I think we only have like 10 minutes left. So ideally we should have played for both the assets and the exposure, but
We need another briefing.
okay.
So what should we do?
Yes, so this is the exposure value for this particular feature to make a book reservation. So ideally, of course, we should have also played for all the assets. We should have discussed what kind of assets does this feature touch, but we don't have time to do that right now, so you just have to assume that you have a list of assets with values. You could imagine the list that I had earlier.
The exposure estimation, is it assumed asset?
No, it's per feature. So it's the feature, the requirement, the function, whatever you are developing. So in this case, is you're implementing something to make a book reservation of a book that's already in there. What is the exposure of that feature? Yeah, so ideally, like I said, we should have played for the values, but we don't have time. But you would then make a list of all the assets that this feature touches. And so if you already have a list of asset values, you reuse that. If there are any new assets that you didn't play for before, you would have to play for that asset.
Question?
Yeah.
We played our first round, and the guy with the highest card made an argument.
Yeah.
And we agreed on a mitigation for this
Yeah.
argument. Is it okay that we say, okay, we're writing this mitigation down and we're doing the next round under this mitigation? Yeah, okay.
You can.
Maybe two last questions before we start into the coffee break. Any thoughts about doing protection poker for an existing system, not just new features?
It's a very good question. As you might have realized, playing protection poker can take some time. And for those of you who are already involved with agile development, you may know that sprint planning meetings and the like are already full of things to do, so there's not much extra time. And in that sense, we have toyed with the idea that you could actually play protection poker as a kind of security push kind of activity. You can use it for onboarding of new team members, to do it as a periodic thing, and then you would do it for an existing system as a way of exploring security aspects of this existing system. You would then, of course, argue for the various features that already exist, and you might actually discover that there are some mitigations that have not been performed that should be performed, etc.
And a last question concerning the assets. Are you evaluating the full assets all the time or just its iteration during the current sprint?
So the ideal situation is that you are continually building on and expanding your asset database. So if things work as intended, you should not have to replay for assets, because a given asset should have a given value for your system and it shouldn't need to change. So that means that, and this is also a thing that helps speed up the game as you go along, because if a new feature only uses existing assets, then you don't really need to play for those assets again.
Okay. So on the website, can you download there the sheets and?
Absolutely. So on the website, I have some extra cards, I think. So if anybody who didn't get a deck wants a deck, you can have one as long as stocks last. But it's we have PDFs of the cards, which you can download and print yourself if you have a very capable laser printer, or if you know somebody with a printing press. And also there is, additionally, I have somewhere here, I think I had, I have, well, I'll find them eventually. I have some copies of a short paper describing the game. You can also find that on the internet, of course. And also, of course, I'm very happy to get any further questions later on by email or Twitter or whatever for any questions regarding protection poker.
Thank you very much, Martin.